I'm going over lineups for YouTube, okay? This is going to be a YouTube video. So you guys, here, you can say hi to YouTube real quick, okay? Should hydrate? Thank you. Current Shellfolk lineup I'm going to play this season. Say hi to YouTube. But yeah, what we're going to be doing here is we spent the last 3 hours. We spent the last 3 hours going over a ton of different decks and their different matchup tables with the intention of creating a few different lineups coming into the last week before seasonals, where we can sort of test these, and sort of use them to, I don't know, to be scrimming and get prepared for seasonals. It's like 10 days away. So here are a few of the lineups that we are looking at. I'm gonna put you guys away. Appreciate you all. Main deck Death Ray? Yeah, Death Ray is really good because it continually gives you spells that target with Ezreal. I think it's actually really good as a one-of. Okay, so the first lineup that we are looking at here is going to be Ezreal Victor. It's going to be with the Shellfolk deck, which, I mean, we recently had a YouTube video on. I think it's pretty solid. The big thing about this lineup that I'm creating, this first one, is that we are beating Feel the Rush, and we are beating aggro. I think FTR is going to be one of the strongest decks of the format. I think that, really the decks that we need to worry about are FTR, Pantheon, and like Taliyah, Ziggs, maybe Sundisk, and then maybe like Sion or something. And I think that this deck is pretty well positioned to be beating FTR, beating most aggro, including Sion. And I think that this is definitely an option for you if that's the direction you want to go. You're definitely banning Pantheon with this lineup. You're also banning like Taliyah, Ziggs, and Sundisk. Those are pretty rough matchups for you. But this is typical Ezreal Victor. Yo, Balvazir.
Ah! Another one!
Why are there so many? Yo, buddy, thanks for the sub. I appreciate it, bud. This is a pretty similar list to the one that I just showed on the YouTube. You can check out the video. I'll maybe put it up there. I don't know. But if you're interested in getting a deck guide on this, pretty similar list. We also are running Ekko Zilean. And this is because Ekko Zilean is really good into FTR, and also kind of like the anti-aggro deck. Of course, you're looking to abuse a lot of your early predictions, flip your Ekko, and just apply a lot of pressure. All of your units have like 3 to 4 health, so it's hard for decks like FTR to actually end up clearing out your units. And then, of course, you have rallies and such and revives to bring back your entire board. Pretty standard list here. Most of the lists have cut Mystic Shot. I think this is the list I stole from Skathis, who's one of the pioneers of this list. But yeah, I think this is pretty solid. And then the third deck in that lineup is going to be Scouts. Scouts is still pretty well positioned into the meta. It is beating FCR. It's one of the... It's a deck that surprisingly is beating aggro pretty consistently. Most Demacia decks kind of fall over to aggro. But this one's pretty good into it. You get MF down, you play for a big Yordle Arms turn. This is a little bit different. We are playing one of Shield of Durand. It's just so good in some matchups to just completely make one of your units unkillable. And otherwise, pretty standard. I think that this is a pretty solid lineup. Definitely an option if you do want to just be beating FTR. You're fine with banning Pantheon. You're fine with banning Shurima. Next lineup that we are on to is going to be an aggro lineup. The idea of this one is that we are beating Pantheon. We're, of course, banning FTR. You want to beat Pantheon. You want to beat Shurima. You're beating Sundisk. You're beating Taliyah, Ziggs. First up is Draven, Rumble, Sion. This is a little bit different of a list than you might have been seeing recently. We've ended up cutting 2 of the Dravens. The idea here is that we're using Draven's Biggest Fan to just tutor Draven. We still get to play 3 copies of Rumble. And Sion, when you have Rumble in your hand, is sort of like an extra copy of Might. You get to discard him, give your Rumble Overwhelm, and it's very strong. It's very aggro. We do have a 1-of Farron for games that go a little bit longer. But I think this is a really cute list. The second deck here is still Fizz, Lulu, Yordle, and Arms. This is a deck that is very bad into anything with Withering Wail, and recently took a couple nerfs, specifically with Yordle and Arms, no longer giving +4/+4, just +3/+3. But I think this deck is still really solid. You still go out onto the board very quickly, and you still blow out so many decks, especially you're still crushing Pantheon and Shurima. I think this is a criminally underrated deck right now. I think it's still very solid. And then third deck is just going to be Pirates. You've seen the list a million times. Only difference, we're cutting down Gameplanks. We are on 2 TF just because red card is so good. Gameplank's a little bit slow, and now he has 4 health. When you're playing into these Shurima decks, having 4 health means that you're a easy target for Rite of the Arcane, so just cutting that. We also are only running Noxie and Fervor as our 3 mana spell, so Zap is always tutoring it. We're not messing around with, Make It Rains, or some people are on Sigil of Malice. Screw that. We are just playing the normal burn. I think that aggro is usually not a great direction to go if you're looking to go to seasonals, because a lot of people really want to be beating aggro. But as is right now, you're beating most of the meta decks. Most of the good decks kind of have bad matchups into aggro. And as long as you're banning FTR, I think this is a pretty solid deck to go for. Next up, we have, if it takes a second to load, we have Ezreal Kennen and Kindred Viego, Lee Aphelios. The idea of this lineup is that you are beating Pantheon, you are beating Feel the Rush, and you are beating aggro. Disclaimer with this lineup has serious consistency issues. Every single one of these decks has consistency issues, and sometimes you don't draw your pieces, sometimes you just get run over. So I don't know if it's the best lineup to go for in a 9-round tournament, just because you're playing a lot of games and eventually things aren't going to go your way. But I do think that this is still going to be a very strong lineup. And when your decks are doing their thing, it does a really strong thing. It definitely has like a nice corner on the meta where you're beating most of the good decks. Ezreal Kennen is a deck that's sort of coming back into the meta with the Ezreal changes. It's very difficult to interact with. It does a ton of burst speed damage. Of course, you get your flipped Kennens. They're getting the marks. 0 mana targets with Ezreal are pretty okay. But yeah, sign game plan when you aren't drawing your Ezreal or your Kennens. And eventually just kind of get there. Big thing with this deck, if you don't draw Kennen, you're in trouble. But like Kennen plus Godwillow, if you find both of those, eventually you're going to find your Ezreal and you're going to be at a good spot. Second deck, Kindred Viego here. I think that this is a deck that's existed for a long time. It's very good into control, and it's pretty solid into aggro. Sometimes it's a little bit, sometimes you just kind of get run over. But in general, I think that this in a pretty good position right now. You get to run your 6-mana Vengeances, your big Hydra Vines. Viego's, of course, really good. We're on Tasty Shellfolk just to sort of shore up your weaknesses to aggro. But otherwise, this deck's really solid. And then third deck is Lee Aphelios. I stole this list from What Am I? And it seems like a pretty cute way to sort of bring this Lee Targon that has been pushed out of the meta for a while and give it a chance back in. You're beating Pantheon because you have the Palms, you have the Wills, even Deny for rallies or Cataclysms. Aphelios using Gravitum to put their dragons in jail forever. And then, of course, you have the Lee Sin over the top. I think it's going to be a pretty solid deck. Definitely has potential here. I think that, Targon Ionia has been such a strong region combination for so long. And I think that Jordan might have ended up cracking with this. But again, this lineup, consistency issues. But I think it definitely has potential. Definitely has potential to be really strong. So check out the next one. Next one is going to be just Pantheon, Sundisk, and Taliyah Ziggs. The idea with this lineup is that you are beating FTR. That's what you're here for. You're here to beat FTR, and you're here to beat a lot of mid-range decks. The issue with this lineup is you're weak into aggro. You're very weak into aggro. But you are playing such strong decks that sometimes you just win anyway, which is, pretty fun. Pantheon, of course, very strong. Standard list here. You're on the Cataclysms. You have a couple rallies. You have a Bastion. It's Pantheon. You've seen Pantheon. Pantheon's still broken as shit. Next up is Sundisk. This is Kever's new list. It is running Time in a Bottle as a one-of, just to sort of, help out with your Sundisk on the turns where you need it. But this deck is still really strong, even after the nerfs. Even if you aren't running a ton of things to take it down, even slowing it down a couple turns, it's still winning the matchups it was winning before. It's still crushing FTR. It's still very strong into a lot of these mid-range decks. It just made it slightly worse in aggro. But with this lineup, you're kind of pretending aggro doesn't exist. And then Taliyah Ziggs, I think, is just an incredibly strong deck right now. It's very good into FTR, and when it's doing its thing, it's just so incredibly powerful. Another side effect of running these two decks is that you're very good into Aphelios decks. Pantheon's a little bit less good into it, but Taliyah Ziggs is just so strong. into almost everything. It's just very weak into aggro. But yeah, I think this is going to be a very popular lineup, honestly, and definitely one to keep an eye out for. And it's one of the main reasons that aggro lineup earlier might be a good option for you. Second to last lineup, we do have Jace Lux, Tribeam, and Zoe Aphelios PNZ. The idea with this lineup is that we are trying to farm sort of everything that isn't the top few decks. You know, in order to beat the top few decks, so people are bringing in some, slightly weird decks. Maybe they're a little bit lower in tier 2. And this is just a solid lineup that's pretty good at beating most things. You're pretty good into aggro. You're pretty good into most mid-range. The issue with this lineup, you aren't beating FTR. And even if you run to like Pantheon, you have a pretty okay Pantheon matchup because Tribeam is very good into Pantheon. Aphelios is very good into Pantheon. Jace Lux, a little bit less so. It's a little bit sus. This is a lot of, if you're comfortable on these decks, I think that you can still do really well with them. I think Jace Lux is a really strong deck. I'm just not certain if it has the specific lineup to really hit on this meta. But, if you are running into a lot of people who are trying to target the meta hard, maybe they're bringing weaker lineups or weaker decks in the tier 2 to target those really strong lineups, this could be a good option for you to sort of take them out. Jace Lux is a pretty standard list. We are running 2 Albus Ferris. I think this deck is incredibly good, or this card is incredibly good at just finishing games. The amount of burn that it gives you is so good, and just drawing cards later on. If your top deck on like turn 9 or turn 10 is this Albus Ferris that draws you another Jace, you can really go the distance against a lot of decks. Other than that, Caitlyn Ezreal, pretty standard list. I am on 1 Guillotine though, over triple Scorched Earth. I think that Guillotine right now, especially with all of the Caitlyn traps that you're putting in with Piltover Peacemaker and with Caitlyn, is really kind of good. Guillotine is such a card that I feel like gets disrespected because it's strictly better than Scorched Earth in every situation, except for the one where you need to throw it at a landmark. And just because of the existence of landmarks, I think that keeping a couple Scorched Earths is still important, but there are times where Noxian Guillotine just rips apart your opponent's entire board, it stacks up your Tribeam, and it just feels so good. Otherwise, a couple stack shocks to be flipping our Ezreal. We have the Whispered Words, and then just pretty normal stuff after that. Farron is very strong right now in a very good position and is really your win con in a lot of these games. This deck's a little bit slower than it has been in the past, but I think it's still pretty solid. And then PNZ Aphelios. Aphelios is so weird because it feels like he should be incredibly strong right now, but he's sort of in a position where he's losing to a lot of the best decks of the format. Because of She Who Wanders getting buffed, he really isn't beating FTR anymore. He doesn't beat the Shreema decks. It is pretty solid into Pantheon. But yeah, I think that this is probably the best way to be playing Aphelios right now. You get a lot of tempo with the ballistic bots and the boom baboons. You're discarding those chompers. Sump Dredger's very strong on board. You push a little bit of damage, and then you just have a ton of over-the-top burn. The triple Mystic Shot, the triple Get Excited, and a 1 of Aftershock. I think this is definitely the type of deck that will crush any deck that isn't just really strong. If somebody's bringing like a low tier 2 deck, Aphelios is just going to run it over. I think it's a very strong deck. But yeah, that's a lineup if you're comfortable on those. And then we have sort of the FTR lineup. I think that FTR is just incredibly strong. It's so good in the meta right now. It's beating most decks in the game. The only things that it's not beating are like Pantheon and like Taliyah Ziggs and like Sundisk. So what I've created here is just a very solid anti-aggro lineup here. It's just control decks out the wazoo here. We have FTR. It is the ramp version. We're running Face of the Old Ones, It That Stares, She Who Wanders, FTR, just your normal stuff. This deck is just so incredibly strong right now, especially ramping into She Who Wanders. Auto wins so many matchups. Definitely a strong deck. Second up, we have Fizz Aphelios. This is a bit of a sleeper deck right now. Well, it's topping a lot of tournaments, but it's not making a ton of noise on ladder. This deck, unlike most other Aphelios decks, is very good into FTR. It's still really good into aggro, and is just able to out mid-range most decks. It's a little bit cheesy, but you just throw a couple things on Fizz, and most decks can't deal with it. It's a very interesting deck. I think I stole this list directly from Majin. And then we just have Sentinels. Sentinels is, just a really solid deck right now. It's very good into aggro. It's beating, a lot of mid-range stuff. It's just very solid and has game into almost everything. It's kind of bad into FTR. Just control decks that go bigger than it, but otherwise is a pretty solid deck. I think overall, if you're just looking to bring 3 solid decks that are beating aggro, you don't want to be losing aggro this season, it's a pretty good lineup to start out with. But yeah, that's going to go ahead and be the lineups that we created here. I'm going to put all of the deck lists in the description. But otherwise, yeah, hope you appreciated that. If you have any questions, feel free to drop it below. And anyway, we'll be back later with more content. Thanks. Bye.